I would sum RuneScape up in 3 words. Goodbye, real life. No, I'm kidding. Okay, I would say, if you can count as 3 words, best MMO ever. Definitely.
This is the story of a world created in a kitchen, of a community bonding as they kill chickens or fish for sharks. It's a sneaky peek behind the scenes of an online world, of its highs and lows, and an attempt to solve something of a mystery. How a video game can still be loved and relevant after 15 years.
When I made this game, I thought it'd be just like any other, and go online, maybe a few people play it, and then that would be it. And certainly didn't expect it to still be running 15 years later and still be being developed 15 years later. It's quite unbelievable just how big the game became. I still can't quite believe it.
But what is RuneScape? Many people won't even have heard of it, yet it's a game that holds 6 Guinness World Records and seen more than 240 million accounts created. Quietly, it's become incredibly popular. Let's put it in perspective. If RuneScape were a country, it would have the 5th largest population in the world. It would have 63% of the population of the USA. It would have 3.2 times the population of the UK. And 8.9 times more than Australia. RuneScape could definitely take Australia.
For me, RuneScape is the ultimate adventure. You have the opportunity to be a hero in a medieval fantasy world, saving people's lives, killing dragons, all sorts of really fantastical things. And it's an experience that you share with thousands of people at the same time. There's mystical, magical properties to the world, so there are goblins and there are orcs and elves and things like that. We never take things too seriously. Yes, you might be battling against forces that are trying to blow up the planet, but you always get a bit of a kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink joke that the players really, really enjoy.
I'd help out myself, but I broke my hammer on a hiker last week.
And we've got this core spine running through it all of gods that stomp about our game world, claiming followers, and then trying to become the single god entity for this entire universe.
You can do whatever you like, and that's the fun part about RuneScape, what sets it apart from everything else.
Weekly updates across 15 years.
You always have something new that you can do the next day.
Us as players, we have the power to contribute to this ever-growing world.
RuneScape represents exactly the type of virtual world that I prefer to live in.
So much can happen in the fantasy world. Magic exists, treasures, adventures, monsters threatening to rip your face off, exploration. All the things that we dream about, we read in fairy tales.
It's a very social game. I like that. If I'm in the mood to just want to chill out and talk to people, I play RuneScape.
That sense of exploration and discovery is far more powerful in a game like RuneScape than most any other MMO.
8 billion fish are caught in RuneScape every year. And every minute, over 2,000 cows are slain, which would make more than 3.5 million burgers in that minute. But that doesn't begin to explain the very strange beast that is RuneScape. Where did it come from? How has it become so popular? Well, to find out, you have to rewind back to the glorious 1980s.
The 80s saw a lot of cliche coming up, bedroom coders make their games. And that's very important, that sort of ability to, with a small team, in many cases, brothers. There's a load of different brothers who started up games companies, and the Gowers are one such set.
I grew up in Nottingham with my family and my brothers Paul and Ian, and we were always very much a gaming family. Played lots of board games and computer games growing up. Played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons with my brother and my dad, and he was always the dungeon master, and we were always exploring the dungeons. And I think that gave a lot of sort of inspiration for a lot of the games I did, and particularly my love of sort of role-playing games and things like that.
They got lots of imagination. They're always playing imaginary games, acting out things. There was a very early fantasy game I played probably when I was about 5, but that was an early fantasy game called Sorcerer's Cave, which is a game where you lay out big tiles on the floor and basically get to explore a dungeon as a character, and probably give me a little bit of influence on what I do even then, you know.
Paul used to do really detailed pictures of castles and pirate ships and all sorts of inventions. There's one called The Battler, and they told the others stories about them. He invented a whole range of characters, and a lot of it was based on what we did. You know, we used to go to castles and go to the seaside, and it was a fantasy version of that.
I first got into computer programming when I was 7 years old, and my dad had a ZX Spectrum, and it came with a book of little programs you could type in.
The funny thing was, I actually bought a book specifically for Paul and another one for Andrew. Paul was far too interested in writing all his fantasy stories and imaginative games to be bothered with tedious computer programming. So once Andrew whistled through his book in no time flat, he then got hold of Paul's book, and to my great astonishment, he then started spending virtually all his time on it.
The first program I made myself was a little man that just walked across the screen. Very simple. I was only 7, but I was ever so excited by the fact that I could do that, and it went from there really.
Very hard to prise Andrew away from the computer sometimes. Occasionally my parents would be like, go out and go for a walk, have some fresh air, and I'm just like, no, I'm sticking on the computer. I know it's a sunny day outside, but I'm in the rhythm.
I mean, I really did just spend my whole teenage years just writing computer games. I just absolutely love making them, and most of them were my own takes on things that I either couldn't afford initially or which hadn't been ported to the Atari ST later, but I always tried to put my own spin on things and make it a bit original. One game I particularly remember making, there was a computer game, a very famous computer game called Lemmings that came out for the Atari ST, and I really wanted to play it, but I didn't have enough money to be able to buy it. I couldn't fork out the £20 it cost, so I decided to make my own copy.
We'd not actually played Lemmings at the time, so we didn't quite know how it worked, which was a good thing because it meant it came out a bit different, but it was a game where you had to make little ramps and stuff to move the ball bearings from the start to various obstacles to the exit, and Andrew did the coding and I did most of the level design for that.
I was very proud of that game because it was the first game I'd made, which I sort of looked at it and thought, wow, actually it doesn't look like it's been made by a kid, it's actually a reasonably playable game. I very much wanted to make one of everything, so I'd sort of go, right, I've made a strategy game, now I need to make an adventure game, or I've made an adventure game, but I haven't made a shooter game yet, and I kind of wanted to see if I could make every type of game.
After leaving school, Andrew moved away from his family home to study computer science at Fitzwilliam College in Cambridge.
When I got there, took my computer with me, desperately worried it was going to get broken in the car because this is the one I'd spent a whole year saving up for. Got it all set up and discovered that the rooms had an internet connection. I said to my friend, and I never lived it down, I don't think I'd use it. Obviously this turned out to be completely, utterly false. And then a few weeks later I caved and got myself a network connection, and I was immediately intrigued by the fact that there was online games you could play.
Games played in a web browser were becoming increasingly popular, and sites started popping up that hosted them. One such site, Games Domain, contacted Andrew and asked if he'd be interested in making games for them.
The biggest game that I made for them was a thing called Castle Games Domain, and this was a multiplayer games parlour, and this was by far the most popular thing I made for them. It regularly had 200 to 300 people sort of playing games at once. You could go in there and you could always get a game. And I managed to get Ian to do some of the graphics for me for Castle Games Domain, and quite a few of the Games Domain games I did actually.
I absolutely jumped on that opportunity. So he would email me a list of requirements, I would email him the graphics back again, and they would get put into the game.
The funny thing was, the money I got from Games Domain far eclipsed the amount I got for my paper round, and I sort of thought, I spent a whole year saving up for this, and I made it back in like a couple of weeks. If only I could have taken a loan. I started thinking, I wanted to make a game a bit more for myself, that wasn't going to sell to someone else. It was going to be my game, and One of my favourite games online at the time was a text-based game called Nanvent, which was a mud that you could play online. And I loved the fact that you could play it any time, day or night, and there'd always be someone there. You could log in at 3 o'clock in the morning and there'd be some person, killing monsters and talking and chatting. And there was loads of these out there, and trying to make one that would stand out from the crowd would be very, very difficult, because one of the key features of these games was that you didn't need to install any software. You could just connect to their server using Telnet and play. And I wanted to get that same play it on any computer, carry on where you left off aspect, but with graphics. And because I knew how to do Java games, I realised I could combine the two together and make basically a graphical mud with all the benefits that a mud would normally have. And when my friend Pete heard out that I was making a graphical mud, he said to me, "Oh, I've got a game a bit like that I've been playing on my computer. It's called Ultima Online. Would you like to see it?"
This Britannia is but one of many in the multiverse that is Ultima Online.
And I played that. I was like, yeah, this is exactly what I'm trying to make. But I didn't get to play it very much, which was probably just as well, because it meant my game didn't come out too similar.
Until now, I never specifically heard that Ultima, was an inspiration for RuneScape. But there's been sort of this wave of people younger than me joining this industry throughout my career. And so when you do the same thing for so long, it means that you get the opportunity to set a few standards and for the younger group to come in and have had a chance to look at it first.
I finally got it to the point where it worked and decided to put it online as a little test that it worked. Didn't have any servers, so it just ran on my computer in my room. I just didn't switch it off. And probably only about a handful of people ever played Devious Mud, just a few people that I knew at Games Domain who I invited to give it a go. And then after a week of running it, I got enough feedback and I shut it down and carried on working on it.
Was the very, very early precursors of RuneScape.
Andrew graduated and found himself in demand. He was offered 2 jobs, one with his friends at Games Domain and another by a guy called Constant Tedder, who ran a competitor, GamesWire. But like a true entrepreneur, Andrew decided to strike it alone and remain self-employed.
I decided, the time was right to pick Devious Mud back up and see if I couldn't finish it off. So started it again, took everything I'd learned from the previous year or two and started making an improved version of it, which I decided to call RuneScape.
RuneScape as a name, I think we sort of came up with just sort of by throwing ideas around between us, throwing down lots of sort of fragments of words, and then trying them together in different combinations and seeing what sounded good. And of course also checking that the domain name was actually free. Once we had RuneScape as a name, the original version of the logo was just the name RuneScape in a straight line on the stones, but all of our friends were sort of joking around, they kept calling it RuneScape. So at that point, I split the line of stones in two and put the sword through the middle just to make sure there could be no ambiguity whatsoever. This was RuneScape, not RuneScape.
One of the things I was always very keen to have in from the start was the ability to make it quite easy to add content to the game. This was quite a common thing for text-based mods anyway, so I decided I'd come up with my own scripting system, which I called RuneScript. I realised that with this scripting system, up until this point, Paul had always come up with a lot of the ideas and the level designs for my games, but he wasn't a programmer, and I'd always had to implement everything he came up with, and I always found that he could come up with the ideas far faster than I could actually implement them. And so by creating this scripting system, I realised that I could actually get Paul to implement the ideas himself, and we could sort of alleviate a little bit of that imbalance.
The early experiments which I was doing to learn how to use Andrew's map editor and RuneScript actually ended up making it into the game in some form or another. So when I was learning how to use the RuneScape map editor that Andrew had created, I actually made Lumbridge and Lumbridge Castle, and it was quite for making a great big castle, and it ended up being the starting point for the game. The first character which I created just to make sure that I could do character conversations was a character called Hans, which is still a character who wanders around Lumbridge Castle. We made the first quest very early on, that was Cook's Assistant. A lot of it was inspired by LucasArts style graphic adventures as well, especially Monkey Island and Dare the Tentacle. A lot of the way the conversation system worked was based on that, so you got all sorts of comical options for what sorts of things to say.
This must be that Woodstock place Mom and Dad are always talking about.
So finally, in January 2001, I got RuneScape to the point where I felt I could actually launch it and give it to the public.
We booted the servers for the first time, and then we all logged on and created our characters, and then Andrew went over to Castle Games Domain because they knew that he was making RuneScape, and told the game players in there, "Hey guys, RuneScape's launched." So a bunch of players came over from Castle Games Domain, and they were the first players of the game.
It was far more popular than we could possibly imagine. Initially, we only had one game world, and that filled up very quickly. And Andrew had to quickly set up more game worlds to take on the extra people that were online. There was always someone playing the game.
And I was trying to do this against the clock because there was more players coming in every day, and I was frantically trying to re-engineer it to keep up with the number of players. I didn't want to turn anybody away. RuneScape launched at a very interesting time because it was just as the internet was becoming a big thing. It was just sort of joining the dot-com bubble slightly after, but internet gaming in particular was still taking off. Online games were just becoming a thing.
Back in the day that I used to play in the 1970s, Dungeons and Dragons had a tremendous appeal, and the internet was now allowing these people to join up together without having to sit in the same room with each other.
Imagine choosing any name and personality you want to be, and then playing other people from all over the country on your personal computer.
The fact that broadband became faster and faster and better in people's homes and cheaper really meant that online games and the internet kind of transformed distribution mechanisms.
It was an independent, self-published game in a time when there wasn't really independent self-published games. We were one of the few people who was actually able to publish our own game. The fact that you could play it without having to install any software, you could just play it in your web browser, it meant it got a big following in schools, where people could play it in their lunch break, and then they could play it when they got home, people could play it in libraries. I think that really helped the spread. And then disaster struck.
Clicks and mortar firms have flourished, but many pure internet companies have had problems this year. Back in March, 4 net-only firms entered the FTSE 100 because their share prices ranked them as a top UK business. Since then, their valuations have tumbled over 70%. No wonder even casual investors are becoming fussier.
The advertisers pulled the plug, they didn't want to buy adverts off me anymore. I suddenly got to the point where the amount of advertising revenue wasn't even enough to cover the hosting costs, and I didn't have a lot in the way of savings, and I was like, I can't afford to run this game, it's costing me money to run it, I'm going to have to shut it down. And I really didn't want to shut it down because I'd spent, well over a year making it by this point, poured everything into it. It was really popular, there's probably about 600,000 people playing it by this point, and really didn't want to shut it down, so a bit of an emergency. So the first thing I did was trying to save money. I moved back to my parents' house in Nottingham.
We actually used half of our parents' kitchen, so Mum put a curtain subdividing the 2 separate bits of our kitchen together and turned half of it into an office, and then we spent about 6 months working for our parents' kitchen.
But they were terribly squashed in. I do remember I couldn't get in to load the washing machine because the computers were all around it.
We could all work together properly. We weren't having to rely on email, and of course we were all playing board games again together as we always have done.
They were going around the house with a microphone looking for interesting sounds.
I remember the cooking sound, and my mum happened to be frying some bacon one day, and I was standing there with a voice recorder recording it, and the sound of cooking in RuneScape Classic is the sound of my mum frying some bacon.
I was a primary school teacher, so it was a school holiday. So I got the time, and I've always loved drawing. So I said I'd have a go, so I did 4 animals for him. I had a camel, a bear, a spider and a bat, and they're all still on Classic.
I did bits and pieces, even though I wasn't much of a graphics artist. I did the RuneScape Classic cow, was my proudest graphical achievement in RuneScape Classic.
After 6 months of working from home, the game was still costing more than it was making. While anyone else would have thrown in the towel, the brothers looked at other options to keep the game running.
We thought about making a members version in the hopes that enough people would want to subscribe.
At this point, I realised that if I was going to start charging the users for playing the game, it was going to be becoming a much more commercial operation. I was going to have to do things a bit more seriously. I wasn't going to be able to just ignore people's customer support emails, and I didn't really know anything about running this sort of business, and I was a bit anxious about taking money off the users directly. And I thought to myself, well, there was that chap who contacted me. I nearly set up a business with Constant Ted. I wonder if he'd be interested in turning this into a proper business where we actually charge a subscription.
Constant was still interested and took them up on their offer. he took on the position of CEO, and they prepared RuneScape to accept paid members.
We sort of figured we need 3,000 people to subscribe out of our 600,000 or so players to cover our hosting costs. Within the first couple of days we had 5,000 subscribers and we're like, we're saved, we've got enough, we're not going to have to shut the game down.
The community, the player base just sort of overwhelmed us in terms of the number of people we took in, even just in that first day.
And I was in a real rush to get the business set up and recruit some staff. Started looking around for an office, found a little sort of incubator for startup businesses called the St. John's Innovation Centre. Went to them and said, need an office, I need it now. We've got people paying for the game, we haven't got any staff to answer their emails, how soon can you get me an office? And they're like, you can have it tomorrow. I was like, yeah, office tomorrow, sign the contract. Had a number of people coming in for an interview after that. Didn't have any furniture at this point, so the interview was taking part in a completely empty office with nothing in it.
Andrew was interviewing people while myself and Constant were wandering in and out of the little office with desks and computers and setting them up behind them, which was probably quite a distracting way to have one's interview.
And I remember the night before sort of frantically Googling sort of like, how do you interview someone? What did you ask at an interview? What are you supposed to do?
My interview was awesome because it was just a room and there was just a table with a laptop on it and Andrew, and that was it. And I thought, what have I sort of stepped into? And he said, can you type something? And I remember Andrew kind of watching me type, and then it was like, great, all right. And then
that was brilliant.
That was most of my interview.
I mean, to start off with, our company was so small that people's first task on their first day was to build their desk and construct their desk and set up their computer. We didn't have any staff who did that sort of thing. We didn't.
When I started, there was one other person, and that was it.
Yeah.
We didn't have the internet. There was RuneScape was running off servers, but we didn't have any internet in the office. And then it was like that week, some point, we got dial-up.
Just like it had grown fast in terms of number of players in the first year, in the second year it was a very rapid growth of the number of people paying for the game, and then we moved office incredibly frequently.
I like the fact that we just knock a hole in the wall and just expand.
I remember Andrew's room though. We used to have about 5 monitors set up. I remember him having this banging trance music.
Yeah,
there was like a screen of code here and something here, and there was this really thumping techno, and I was blown away by that.
I'd grown up looking at things like MUDs, multi-user dungeons, and I had been a role player all my life, so running sort of Dungeons and Dragons campaigns.